14. Informative speaking. Sarah Kim, Douglas Marshall, June Pulliam, Victoria Vanist, and James Yergin. Chapter Overview. 14. Informative speaking. 14.1. Learning objectives. 14.2. What is an informative speech? 14.3. Types of informative speeches. 14.4. Guidelines for informative speech. Topic selection and preparation. 14.5. Sample informative speeches and speech outlines. 14.1. Learning objectives. Recognize opinion versus factual information. Recognize the different types of informative speeches. Distinguish the best organizational approach for types of informative speeches. Employ proven guidelines for preparing an informative speech. Construct an informative speech. Learning objectives. 14.2. What is an informative speech? An informative speech can first be defined as a speech based entirely and exclusively on facts. Basically, an informative speech conveys knowledge, a task that every person engages in every day in some form or another. Whether giving someone who is lost driving directions, explaining the specials of the day as a server, or describing the plot of a movie to friends, people engage in forms of informative speaking daily. Secondly, an informative speech does not attempt to convince the audience that one thing is better than another. Does not advocate a course of action. Consider the following two statements. 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. George Washington was the first president of the United States. In each case, the statement made is what can be described as irrefutable, meaning a statement or claim that cannot be argued. In the first example, even small children are taught that having 2 apples and then getting 2 more apples will result in having 4 apples. This statement is irrefutable in that no one in the world will argue this. It is a fact. Similarly, with the statement George Washington was the first president of the United States, this again is an irrefutable fact. If you asked 100 history professors and read 100 history textbooks, the professors and textbooks would all say the same thing: Washington was the first president. No expert, reliable source, or person with any common sense would argue about this. Informative speech is not a persuasive speech. Informative speech is fundamentally different from a persuasive speech in that it does not incorporate opinion as its basis. This can be the tricky part of developing an informative speech because some opinion statements sometimes sound like facts but are really opinion. For example, in an informative speech on George Washington, you might say, George Washington was one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. While this statement may be agreed upon by most people, it is possible for some people to disagree and argue the opposite point of view. The statement George Washington was one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States is not irrefutable, meaning someone could argue this claim. If, however, you present the opinion as an opinion from a source that is acceptable, it is a fact that someone holds the opinion. You do not want your central idea, your main points, and the majority of your supporting material to be opinion or argument in an informative speech. Unlike in persuasive speeches, in an informative speech you should never take sides on an issue, nor should you spin the issue in order to influence the opinions of the listeners. Even if you are informing the audience about differences in views on controversial topics, you should simply and clearly describe and explain the issues. This is not to say, however, that the audience's needs and interests have nothing to do with the informative speech. We come back to the WIFM principle because even though an informative speech is fact-based, it still needs to relate to people's lives in order to maintain their attention. Why informative speech is important? The question may arise here. If we can find anything on the internet now, why bother to give an informative speech? The answer lies in the unique relationship between audience and speaker found in the public speaking context. The speaker can choose to present information that is of most value to the audience. Secondly, the speaker is not just overloading the audience with data. As we have mentioned before, that's not really a good idea because audiences cannot remember great amounts of data and facts after listening. The focus of the content is what matters. This is where the specific purpose and central idea come into play. Remember, public speaking is not a good way to dump data on the audience, but to make information meaningful. Finally, although we have stressed that the informative speech is fact-based and does not have the purpose of persuasion, information still has an indirect effect on someone. If a classmate gives a speech on correctly using the Heimlich maneuver to help a choking victim, the side effect is that the audience would use it when confronted with the situation. 14.3 Types of informative speeches. While topics that are suitable for informative speeches are nearly limitless, they can generally be pared down into 5 broad categories. Understanding the type of informative speeches can help you to figure out the best way to organize, research, and prepare for it. Type 1. History. A common approach to selecting an informative speech topic is to discuss the history or development of something. With so much of human knowledge available via the internet, finding information about the origins and evolution of almost anything is much easier than it has ever been. With that in mind, some of the areas that a historical informative speech could cover are below. Objects. History of objects such as the baseball or the saxophone can be presented in your informative speech. Someone at some point in history was the first to develop what is considered modern baseball. An informative speech speaker could give a speech on the history of baseball. Who was it? What was it originally made of? How did it evolve into the baseball that is used by Major League Baseball today? Places. You can also give an informative speech on the history of physical places such as the Eiffel Tower or the Disney World. The Disney World of today is different from the Disney World of the early 1970s. The design has developed over the last 50+ years. Stories on the first things built in the Disney World, first theme parks, and how it expanded and built in other parts of the world can all be interesting historical elements to share with your audience. Ideas. It is also possible to provide facts on an idea such as democracy or freedom of speech. For example, while no one can definitively point to a specific date or individual who first developed the concept of democracy, it is known to have been conceived in ancient Greece. By looking at the civilizations and cultures that adopted forms of democracy throughout history, it is possible to provide an audience with a better understanding of how the idea has been shaped into what it has become today. Type 2. Biography. A biography is similar to a history, but in this case the subject is specifically a person, whether living or deceased. For the purposes of this class, biographies should focus on people of some note or fame, since doing research on people who are not at least mildly well known could be difficult. But again, as with histories, there are specific and irrefutable facts that can help provide an overview of someone's life, such as dates that President Lincoln was born and died and the years he was in office as president. This might be a good place to address research and support. The basic dates of Abraham Lincoln's life could be found in multiple sources, and you would not have to cite the source in that case. But you use the work of a specific historian to explain how Lincoln was able to win the presidency in the tumultuous years before the Civil War, that would need a citation of that author and the publication. Type 3. Processes. Process speeches provide information on steps to accomplish a specific task, goal, or process. For example, speakers can talk about how to bake chocolate chip cookies, how to throw a baseball, how a nuclear reactor works, and how a bill works its way through Congress. Process speeches are sometimes referred to as demonstration or how-to speeches because they often entail demonstrating or performing something. These speeches provide step-by-step instructions on completing a specific task. However, not all process speeches tell the audience how to perform something but rather only explain the procedures so audience can gain understanding on how things work. Type 4. Ideas and concepts. Sometimes an informative speech is designed to explain an idea or concept. What does democracy mean? What is justice? In speeches on ideas and concepts, speakers should first define the idea or concept and then provide specific examples to make your concept concrete, real, and tangible to your audience. Type 5. Categories or divisions. Sometimes an informative speech topic doesn't lend itself to a specific type of approach, and in those cases the topics tend to fall into a general category of informative speeches. For example, if a student wanted to give an informative speech on the 4 C's of diamonds, they certainly wouldn't approach it as if they were providing the history of diamonds, nor would they necessarily be informing anyone on how to shop for or buy diamonds or how diamonds are mined. The approach in this case would simply be to inform an audience on the 4 C's and what they mean. Other examples of this type of informative speech would be positions in playing volleyball or the customs to know when traveling in China. As stated above, identifying the type of informative speech being given can help in several ways, but perhaps the biggest benefit is that the type of informative speech being given will help determine to some degree the organizational pattern that will need to be used. For example, a how-to speech must be in chronological order. There really isn't a way to present a how-to speech other than how the process is done in a time sequence. That is to say, for a speech on how to bake chocolate chip cookies, getting the ingredients must come before mixing the ingredients, which must come before baking them. Putting them in any other order will only confuse the audience. Similarly, most histories and biographies will be organized chronologically, but not always. It makes sense to explain the history of the baseball from when it was first developed to where it is today, but certain approaches to histories and biographies can make that irrelevant. For an informative speech on Benjamin Franklin, a student might choose as his or her 3 main points: 1. His time as a printer; 2. His time as an inventor; 3. His time as a diplomat. These main points are not in strict chronological order because Franklin was a printer, inventor, and diplomat at the same time during periods of his whole life. However, this example would still be one way to inform an audience about him without using the chronological organizational pattern. As for general informative speeches, since the topics that can be included in this category are very diverse and cover a range of subject matter, the way they are organized will be varied as well. However, if the topic is types of something or kinds of something, the organizational pattern would be topical. If it were the layout of a location, such as the White House, it would be spatial. 14.4. Guidelines for informative speech topic selection and preparation. Pick a focus topic. Don't be too broad in preparing an informative speech. One of the most common misconceptions students have is that they must be comprehensive in covering their topic, which isn't realistic. Let's say a student selects a topic and proposes the following specific purpose statement: to inform my audience about the Civil War. The Civil War was, conservatively speaking, 4 years long, resulted in over 750,000 casualties, and arguably changed the course of human history. So to think that it is possible to cover all of that in 5 to 7 minutes is unrealistic. Also, a typical college library has hundreds of books dealing with the Civil War. A revised specific purpose for this speech might be something like, to inform my audience about the Gettysburg Address. This topic is much more compact, and doing research will now be exponentially easier, although you will still find hundreds of sources on it. Or an even more specific topic would be like the one in the outline at the end of this chapter: to inform my classmates of the specific places in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, that are considered haunted. Instead of looking through all the books in your campus library on the Civil War, searching through the library's databases and catalog for material on the Gettysburg Address will yield a much more manageable number of books and articles. It may sound counterintuitive, but selecting a speech topic that is very specifically focused will make the research and writing phases of the informative speech much easier. Another example is a student who wants to deliver an informative speech on Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was 56 years old when he died. So to think that it is possible to cover his entire life story in 5 to 7 minutes is unrealistic. The better option is to select 3 aspects of his life and focus on those as a way to provide an overall picture of who he was. So a proposed speech on Lincoln might have the specific purpose to inform my audience about Abraham Lincoln's administration of the Civil War. This is still a huge topic in that massive books have been written about it, but it could be addressed in 3 or 4 main points, such as 1. The Civil War began in the aftermath of Lincoln's election and inauguration. 2. Finding the right military leaders for the Union was his major challenge at the beginning. 3. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the nature of the war. For Lincoln adopted a policy that led to the North's victory. Regardless of the topic, you will never be able to cover everything that is known about your topic, so don't try. Select the things that will best help the audience gain a general understanding of the topic that will interest them and that they hopefully will find valuable. For additional tips for selecting the right informative speech topics and preparing the speech, watch the following videos. Avoid faux or fake informative speech topics. Sometimes students think that because something sounds like an informative speech topic, it is one. This happens a lot with political issues that are usually partisan in nature. Some students may feel that the speech topic to inform my audience why William Henry Harrison was a bad president sounds factual, but really this is an opinion. Similarly, a number of topics that include conspiracy and paranormal subject matter are usually mistaken for good informative topics as well. It is not uncommon for a student to propose the topic to inform my audience about the existence of extraterrestrials, thinking it is a good topic. After all, there is plenty of evidence to support the claim, right? There are pictures of unidentified objects in the sky that people claim are from outer space. There are people who claim to have seen extraterrestrials, and most powerful of all, there are people who say that they have been abducted by aliens and taken into space. Problem here, as you have probably already guessed, is that these facts are not irrefutable. Not every single person who sees something unknown in the sky will agree it is an alien spacecraft, and there can be little doubt that not everyone who claims to have been abducted by a UFO is telling the truth. This isn't to say that you can't still do an informative speech on alien sites. For example, two viable options are to inform my audience about the SETI project or to inform my audience of the origin of the Area 51 conspiracy. However, these types of speeches can quickly devolve into opinion if you aren't careful, which would then make them persuasive speeches. Even if you start by trying to be objective, unless you can present each side equally, it will end up becoming a persuasive speech. Additionally, when a speaker picks such a topic, it is often because of a latent desire to persuade the audience about them. Be accurate, clear, and interesting. A good informative speech conveys accurate information to the audience in a way that is clear and that keeps the listener interested in the topic. Achieving all three of these goals, accuracy, clarity, and interest, is the key to being an effective speaker. If information is inaccurate, incomplete, or unclear, it will be of limited usefulness to the audience. Part of being accurate is making sure that your information is current. Even if you know a great deal about your topic or wrote a good paper on the topic in a high school course, you will need to verify the accuracy and completeness of what you know, especially if it is medical or scientific information. Most people understand that technology changes rapidly, so you need to update your information almost constantly. The same is true for topics that, on the surface, may seem to require less updating. For example, the Civil War occurred over 150 years ago, but contemporary research still offers new and emerging theories about the causes of the war and its long-term effects. So even with a topic that seems to be unchanging, carefully check the information to be sure it's accurate and up-to-date. What defines interesting? In approaching the informative speech, you should keep in mind the good overall principle that the audience is asking, "What's in it for me?" The audience is either consciously or unconsciously wondering, "What in this topic for me? How can I use this information? Of what value is this speech content to me? Why should I listen to it?" One reason this textbook uses examples of the Civil War is that the author's college is located by several Civil War sites and even a major battlefield. Students see reminders of the Civil War on a regular basis. You might consider it one of the jobs of the introduction to directly or indirectly answer these questions. If you can't, then you need to think about your topic and why you are addressing it. If it's only because the topic is interesting to you, you are missing the point. For example, why should we know about Abraham Lincoln's administration of the Civil War? Obviously, because it had significant long-term consequences to Americans, and you should articulate that in terms the audience can understand. Keep in mind audience diversity. Finally, remember that not everyone in your audience is the same, so an informative speech should be prepared with audience diversity in mind. If the information in a speech is too complex or too simplistic, it will not hold the interest of the listeners. Determining the right level of complexity can be hard. Audience analysis is one important way to do this. Do the members of your audience belong to different age groups? Did they all go to public schools in the United States, or are some of them international students? Are they all students majoring in the same subject, or is there a mixture of majors? Never assume that just because an audience is made up of students, they all share a knowledge set. Do enough research and try to include examples and supporting material that will resonate with your diverse audience. 14.5 Sample Informative Speeches and Speech Outline. Sample Informative Speech Outline by Shannon Stanley. Topic: Lord Byron. Specific purpose: to inform my audience about the life of George Gordon, Lord Byron. Central idea: George Gordon, Lord Byron overcame physical hardships, was a world-renowned poet, and an advocate for the Greeks' war for freedom. Introduction. Attention step. Imagine an 11-year-old boy who has been beaten and sexually abused repeatedly by the very person who is supposed to take care of him. B. Reveal topic. Thesis. This is one of the many hurdles that George Gordon, better known as Lord Byron, overcame during his childhood. Lord Byron was also a talented poet with the ability to transform his life into the words of his poetry. Byron became a serious poet by the age of 15, and he was first published in 1807 at the age of 19. Lord Byron was a staunch believer in freedom and equality, so he gave most of his fortune and in the end his very life supporting the Greeks' war for independence. See establish credibility. While many of you have probably never heard of Lord Byron, his life and written work will become more familiar to you when you take Humanities 1201, as I learned when I took it last semester. D. Preview Body of Speech. In this speech I will talk about Lord Byron's early childhood, accomplishments, and life outside of poetry transition. Let me start with Lord Byron's childhood. Body A. Main Point 1. Lord Byron's childhood I Sub Point 1. Birth and disability A. Lord Byron was born on January 22, 1788 to Captain John Byron and Catherine Gordon Byron. B. According to Paul Trueblood, the author of Lord Byron's father only married Catherine for her dowry, which he quickly went through, leaving his wife and child nearly penniless. C. By the age of 2, Lord Byron and his mother had moved to Aberdeen in Scotland, and shortly thereafter, his father died in France at the age of 36. D. Lord Byron was born with a clubbed right foot, which is a deformity that caused his foot to turn sideways instead of remaining straight, and his mother had no money to seek treatment for this painful and embarrassing condition. He would become very upset and fight anyone who even spoke of his lameness. Despite his handicap, Lord Byron was very active and liked competing with the other boys. 2.2 Later childhood sexual abuse. At the age of 10, his granduncle died, leaving him the title as the 6th Baron Byron of Rochdale. With this title, he also inherited Newstead Abbey, a dilapidated estate that was in great need of repair. B. Because the abbey was in Nottinghamshire, England, he and his mother moved there and stayed at the abbey until it was rented out to pay for the necessary repairs. C. During this time, May Gray, Byron's nurse, had already begun physically and sexually abusing him. A year passed before he finally told his guardian John Hanson about May's abuse. She was fired immediately. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done. In the book Lord Byron, it is stated that years later he wrote, "My passions were developed very early, so early that few would believe me if I were to state the period and the facts which accompanied it." Transition. Although Lord Byron had many obstacles to overcome during his childhood, he became a world-renowned poet by the age of 24. B. Main Point 2. Lord Byron's accomplishments as a poet I Sub Point 1. Beginning of the career A. Lord Byron experienced the same emotions we all do, but he was able to express those emotions in the form of his poetry and share them with the world. B. According to Horace Gregory, the author of poems of George Gordon, Lord Byron, the years from 1816 through 1824 is when Lord Byron was most known throughout Europe. C. But according to Paul Trueblood, Childe Harold was published in 1812 and became one of the best-selling works of literature in the 19th century. D. Childe Harold was written while Lord Byron was traveling through Europe after graduating from Trinity College. Many authors such as Trueblood and Garrett, the author of George Gordon, Lord Byron, express their opinion that Childe Harold is an autobiography about Byron and his travels. 2. Poem topics A. Lord Byron often wrote about the ones he loved the most, such as the poem She Walks in Beauty written about his cousin in Wilmot, and stanzas for music written for his half-sister Augusta Lee. B. He was also an avid reader of the Old Testament and would write poetry about stories from the Bible that he loved. One such story was about the last king of Babylon. This poem was called The Vision of Belshazzar and is very much like the Bible version in the Book of Daniel. Transition. Although Lord Byron is mostly known for his talents as a poet, he was also an advocate for the Greeks' war for independence. See Main Point 3. Lord Byron's life other than poetry I Sub Point 1. Byron arrived in Greece in 1823 during a civil war. A. Lord Byron, after his self-imposed exile from England, took the side of the Greeks in their war for freedom from Turkish rule. B. The Greeks were too busy fighting amongst themselves to come together to form a formidable army against the Turks. According to Martin Garrett, Lord Byron donated money to refit the Greeks' fleet of ships but did not immediately get involved in the situation. He had doubts as to if or when the Greeks would ever come together and agree long enough to make any kind of a difference in their war effort. See eventually the Greeks united and began their campaign for the Greek War of Independence. He began pouring more and more of his fortune into the Greek army and finally accepted a position to oversee a small group of men sailing to Missolonghi. Lord Byron set sail for Missolonghi in western Greece in 1824. He took a commanding position over a small number of the Greek army despite his lack of military training. He had also made plans to attack a Turkish-held fortress but became very ill before the plans were ever carried through. Death. Lord Byron died on April 19, 1824 at the age of 36 due to the inexperienced doctors who continued to bleed him while he suffered from a severe fever. After Lord Byron's death, the Greek War of Independence, due to his support, received more foreign aid which led to their eventual victory in 1832. Lord Byron is hailed as a national hero by the Greek nation. Many tributes such as statues and road names have been devoted to Lord Byron since the time of his death. Conclusion. Signal. End of speech. In conclusion, review main points and summarize. Lord Byron overcame great physical hardships to become a world-renowned poet, and is seen as a hero to the Greek nation and is mourned by them still today. Sense of completeness. Clincher. Memorable ending. I have chosen not to focus on Lord Byron's more liberal way of life, but rather to focus on his accomplishments in life. He was a man who owed no loyalty to Greece, yet gave his life to support their cause. Most of the world will remember Lord Byron primarily through his written attributes, but Greece will always remember him as the trumpet voice of liberty. Sample informative speech by Pamela Meyer references Garrett M. George Gordon. Lord Byron. New York, New York, Oxford University Press. Gregory H. Poems of George Gordon. Lord Byron. New York, New York, Thomas Y. Crowell Company. Trueblood P.G. Lord Byron. New York, New York, Twain Publishers.